I use these few moments of introduction usually just to say whatever pops up in my head that might be of interest. This one's actually Mozart related. Usually I don't do it, but because my handwriting is such that you need to usually take it to a pharmacist to read it. This week we're primarily doing symphonies of Mozart. The last 2 weeks have been devoted mostly to concertos. And tonight we have 2 symphonies that each have titles, if you look in the program book. And then I thought about the other composer who has a lot of titles with his symphonies. That composer is Joseph Haydn. Among Haydn's titled works are his early Morning Symphony, his Noon Symphony, and his Night Symphony. Number 22, The Philosopher. There's a Horn Signal Symphony. There's his 45th, The Farewell. The Schoolmaster, 82 and 83, respectively, called The Bear and the Hen. There is, of course, 94, The Surprise Symphony. There is 96, which is the Miracle Symphony, 101, which is the Clock Symphony, and 103, which is the Drum Roll. Really wonderful titles that make you curious about the pieces. I think Mozart must have thought that Haydn took all the good titles. So what he did is, well, in many cases he simply put the name of the city where the premiere would take place. So that's why we have the Paris, Prague, and Linz symphonies. Another one that sometimes gets subtitles is his 25th, called the Little G Minor. He didn't give it that name. He certainly didn't give the name of his last symphony that somebody attached Jupiter to it. But more curious is the Haffner Symphony, which is simply the family that commissioned it. So for all the great masterpieces and all the wonderful things, I kind of feel sorry for the guy. Such an original master, but kind of boring titles. But the pieces make up for it. Oh, and then there's that other little piece we play at the beginning. How does it go? Dum, bum, 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 bum. Oh, here's Kathryn.
Good evening, everyone. You're a small but enthusiastic audience tonight, I can see. So on the screen behind me, we've got a picture of the interior of the Burgtheater, which was the scene for a lot of Mozart's really important occasions. So you can I'm going to have it up here for a little while so you can put yourself in it and imagine on the left where the stage is, Mozart would be sitting at his piano, the orchestra would be nearby, just in front of the rows of seats. And on the far right, the imperial box, the emperor would be sitting whenever possible. He loved to go and hear Mozart perform. So when we consider Mozart's hundreds of works, in all of their abundance and variety, we realize that despite his legendary fluency of composition, he must have been spending most of his time working, often at multiple projects at once. And we can't help but wonder, what motivated him? What factors propelled him to his writing desk? And how did he prioritize his projects? One thing we know about Mozart is that he was both busy and practical, and when he began a new work, it was nearly always with a particular performance in view. It might be an occasion or a commission, but it was almost never a random burst of inspiration. His largest works, his operas, as might be obvious, were all commissioned by theaters or by impresarios associated with them. No composer in his right mind would embark on such an enormous task without knowing where and when it would be presented, what librettist he would work with, what singers would be engaged, and many other negotiated details. At the other extreme, we have the small works, such as piano sonatas, violin sonatas, which usually were linked to no occasion or commission, but instead intended for publication. In Mozart's time, there was a growing market for music that could be bought and played by amateurs, and he recognized an important source of income in that. So such sonatas and much of his chamber music were written specifically for that purpose and stand outside the occasion commission impulse. It's when we think about the major instrumental works, the symphonies, concertos, serenades, and so forth, that the questions, what occasion and whose commission, arise. And these are fascinating questions because they offer us insight into how Mozart engaged with the world and with whom through his music. Most of the works that we're hearing during this festival are embedded with these stories and narratives. Many of the commissions that he received throughout his career came from performers who wanted new concertos by him. A number of his keyboard concertos were commissioned by excellent women players, both professional and amateur. Two of his early concertos were composed for aristocratic ladies in Salzburg. His first truly great piano concerto, K271 in E-flat, was written for French keyboardist Victoire Genami, daughter of the celebrated choreographer Noverre. Mozart had known both of them for some years when he wrote the concerto for her. He wrote his B-flat concerto, K456, for the blind professional pianist Maria Theresia von Paradis, who took it on a concert tour with her in 1784. In Paris, she played quite often, to great acclaim and great reviews. Mozart wrote two piano concertos for an accomplished amateur, Barbara Ployer, who studied with him. She commissioned the concertos in E-flat, K449, and G, K453, and premiered both of them for private audiences, including Mozart, at her home in Vienna. That must have been a little intimidating, I would think. Last weekend, I gave a talk about all of the terrific wind concertos that he wrote, which we've been hearing over the course of this festival. All of those were commissioned by male friends and colleagues, such as the oboe and bassoon concertos for members of the Salzburg Court Orchestra, the flute concerto for the surgeon amateur Ferdinand de Jong in Mannheim, the four horn concertos for his lifelong friend Joseph Leitgeb, and the spectacular clarinet concerto for his friend Anton Stadler in Vienna. As commissioned works, their premieres were not controlled by the composer, but rather the performers who had requested and paid for them and were enabled to make such decisions. The bulk of Mozart's concertos, especially the great series of piano concertos produced after he arrived in Vienna, were not due to commissions, but reflect his own occasions, the many private and public concerts that he gave as he established himself as a virtuoso in the imperial capital. Whether he played in a salon, a casino, or the big theater that you see behind me, the concerto was his most popular vehicle. Such occasions not only brought him income and built his audiences, they also developed his network of musician friends on whom he relied in every concerto, and the dialogue that made this a most vibrant and convivial genre. For an example where commission and occasion merge, we might consider on this evening's program the so-called Haffner Symphony, which was given that name by Mozart himself when he referred to it in his letters to his father. And the first question begging to be asked is, who was Haffner? The Haffners were prominent residents of Salzburg when Mozart was growing up and family friends. The elder Siegmund Haffner was mayor of Salzburg. His son, the younger Siegmund Haffner, was born the same year as Mozart, so they were exact contemporaries. And this is the Siegmund Haffner who concerns us. In 1776, Haffner had commissioned a serenade from Mozart for the wedding of his sister that July. Now, serenades were light, celebratory works, including dance and march movements and other sort of symphonic style movements, and they were often played outdoors for special occasions. Mozart's father wrote dozens of them. Mozart himself wrote several of them in Salzburg for the outdoor festivities that marked the close of the academic year at the local Benedictine university. So he composed a pleasant serenade for Haffner, and years later, in July 1782, Mozart received a commission for yet another serenade from Haffner. This time the occasion was a ceremony that would bestow a noble title upon Herr Haffner, so there was a special urgency involved. But at this point in his career, Mozart was in Vienna, and when he got this request from his father, he wrote, "I'm up to my eyes in work, and now you ask me to write a new symphony? How on earth can I do it? I shall work as fast as possible, and as far as haste permits, I shall turn out good work." Then he had to rush to get the music sent off to Salzburg in chunks, and in the meantime, he was busy working on other things, like a new arrangement of his opera, Abduction from the Seraglio, for wind band. But he squeezed in the serenade for Haffner, and he wrote to his father, "I hope only that everything will be on time and according to your taste. The first allegro needs a really fiery tempo, and the last should be as fast as possible." Now, some months passed, and Mozart found himself working towards a big public concert that he planned to give at the Burgtheater on the 23rd of March. As usual, he was busy and overburdened, and he remembered the Haffner music and asked his father to send it back to him. He was pleasantly surprised, remembering how quickly he had composed it, that it was so good. So he dusted it off, cut the march, cut one of the minuets so that it turned into a 4-movement symphony, added new flute and clarinet parts to make it suitable for his orchestra in Vienna. And behold, what had been a serenade was now the new Haffner Symphony. He used it to frame his program, which was very full. It had arias, piano concertos, a section of improvisation that was designed specifically to please the emperor who was sitting in his box for this occasion. And he had the first movements of the symphony open the program, and its finale concluded the program. Now, we're not used to seeing a symphony used in this fashion today. But it's interesting to think that here, Mozart regards the opening movements of his symphony as a kind of overture to his program, which includes mostly dramatic music in the form of arias and concertos. And in the second half of the program, at the heart of the program, we find Mozart, who has already played the solo part in 2 of his concertos, and he takes the spotlight alone with his piano on the stage, and he improvises, and he plays newly composed variations. Then he concludes with yet another big vocal number, and at last, the finale of his symphony. So here we have a great example of a major work that originated as a commission and was transformed by Mozart and repurposed for a new occasion. We have an excellent idea of who besides the emperor would have been present at a concert like this. And I've put up here one of the actual concert tickets that Mozart had printed off at some time in 1783 for the next couple seasons of concerts. There are only 4 of these tickets that survive today. They're precious relics. One of Mozart's letters to his father preserves a list of 175 subscribers who had purchased tickets to his concert series in the spring of 1784. And the list is full of nearly all of the members of the local aristocracy and the diplomatic corps and people associated with the court. So it's a very illustrious list of persons. Mozart's so-called Linz Symphony was also written in a tearing hurry, this time to seize an opportunity that presented itself during one of his journeys. In the summer of 1783, he and his wife Constanza had visited Salzburg, and on their way back to Vienna, they stopped in the town of Linz to pay a call on an old friend. This was an elderly gentleman, Count Johann Joseph von Thun-Hohenstein. I'm sorry that I don't have a picture of him. And he invited the Mozarts to come and stay with him while they were in Linz, in his palace in the town. He was the father-in-law of Mozart's friend and patroness in Vienna, the Countess Wilhelmina von Thun. Mozart wrote to his father that, "On Tuesday, the 4th of November, I will give a musical evening here in the theater. And because I do not have a single symphony with me, I'm writing a new one at breakneck speed, which has to be ready by then." Let's pause to consider for a moment a guy who might even have thought he could be traveling with symphonies, just pull them out of his suitcase and be ready at a moment's notice. So we know that this work was not a commission, but designed for an occasion, a particular performance of Mozart's own that he seized the opportunity to put on. It was premiered that evening in the theater in Linz, but what else might have been on the program, we have no idea. We also know that Mozart had the work performed again in another big Burgtheater concert, and his father had it performed in Salzburg. And the next time Mozart saw old Count Thun was in Prague, where he also had a palace. He moved back and forth between Linz and Prague. And again, he invited Mozart and Constanze to stay with him. And it's important to know that Count Thun was a great music lover who always traveled with his own ensemble of musicians. And they played for Mozart when he came to visit. It's thought very likely that the Count still had the parts of the Linz Symphony in his library, and that this was one of the works, along with the Prague Symphony, that were played on Mozart's big public concert there in Prague. So here we have a chain of events involving a single symphony and showing how Mozart tended to make use of works and keep them available to employ as needed. Now, one of the most valuable and treasured sources of information that we have about Mozart's works is a small catalog that he kept for himself, beginning in February 1784, just as his career was beginning to get really busy and he felt a need to be more systematic and professional. It's very helpful to us in sorting out at least some of his commissions and occasions. On the left side of each opening in the book, he enters the date and a brief description of the new work, a trio, an aria, a concerto, or whatever. Sometimes he lists the instrumentation, and often he'll mention who he wrote it for, especially if it involved one or more singers. On the right side, he enters the main theme of the new piece. So those are the little musical incipits that you see on the right. On the 10th of August, 1787, Mozart made the following entry in his Catalogue. Eine kleine Nacht Musick, a little night music, consisting of an allegro, minuet and trio, romance, minuet and trio, and finale. At the end of the entry, Mozart writes, 2 violins, viola, and basses. This night music seems to have been conceived for a small chamber orchestra, perhaps 1 or 2 instruments per part, or even for a string quartet with added bass. At this time, Mozart was really busy. He was working on the second act of Don Giovanni, getting it ready for its premiere in Prague. But why did he take the time out from his opera to compose this? What occasion or commission did he have in mind? One little clue, perhaps, is his title for the work, Nacht Musick. In German, this meant a serenade, like the ones that he wrote for Haffner. And an early 18th century music dictionary said that it was called an evening piece or a night piece because such works are usually performed on quiet and pleasant nights, the implication being out of doors. Both of the Haffner serenades were written for celebrations, which seemed to be their normal function. So we have to think that this piece also was destined for some kind of festive occasion or celebration. We know from Mozart's description that he wrote 5 movements for it, but one of the minuets and trios has been lost for a very long time. So what would have been a 5-movement work now has the 4 movements more typical of a symphony. If Mozart received a commission from Salzburg for this piece, we would probably not know about it. We don't know about it. because his main correspondent, his father Leopold, had died that May. If it was for someone in Vienna, it was probably for a private function using modest instrumental forces. In any case, Mozart left a record only of the composition itself, not its purpose, so that much remains a mystery. Now, at the very end of 1787, an event took place that had a deep impact on Mozart's compositional practice for the rest of his life. Emperor Joseph II formally granted him an appointment as court chamber composer with a good annual salary and freedom to compose. Mozart had always dreamed of such a position, and its attainment opened up new vistas to his imagination. It is in this light that we should regard his three last symphonies, number 39 in E flat, number 40 in G minor, and number 41 in C. These are big works, large in scale and ambition and full of expressive power. He devoted the entire summer of 1788 to them and entered each one in his catalog as he completed it. 26 June, 25 July, 10 August. Each entry is terse, simply stating a symphony and providing the instrumentation. In the spring, he had worked on a new production of Don Giovanni for Vienna, and he had written new arias for it. His other projects that summer were chamber pieces, including piano trios and some small sonatas, and those we know were intended for publication. It's the big symphonies that Mozart certainly composed with some occasion in mind. But what? This is one of the reasons that scholars bemoan the death of Mozart's father. Without him waiting in Salzburg for news of his son's activities and triumphs, with the cessation of their valuable correspondence, we have a lot less information about the musical events of Mozart's last years. But one person he was in touch with by letter was one of his brethren in his Masonic lodge, Michael Puchberg, to whom he wrote a series of letters during this period. He mentions to Puchberg late that summer that he's about to give a series of concerts in the casino. This could have meant the casino room in the Trattnerhof, which is the big building that you see on the right in this slide. Mozart had held other concerts there. Or perhaps a new casino that had recently opened in the same neighborhood. Unfortunately, no evidence has ever emerged that this concert series actually took place. But Mozart did take part in a series of concerts organized by his patron, Gottfried van Swieten, where he directed his own new arrangements of Handel's oratorios, including Messiah, and where a big orchestra would have been present. What perfect occasions for grand symphonies by the new imperial court composer. We also know that Mozart's symphonies appeared on concert programs in other cities that Mozart visited during the next 2 years. And another important piece of evidence is the fact that Mozart actually revised the G minor symphony, adding new clarinet parts. That is a clear sign that he had a specific performance in mind for it. And indeed, you'll see, this is the advertisement, the playbill, for a big concert by Vienna's Society of Musicians, which took place again in the Burgtheater with Salieri conducting, and the clarinetist brothers Johann and Anton Stadler participating. The first item on the program was a grand symphony composed by Herr Mozart. This had to have been either Symphony No. 39 or the newly revised Symphony No. 40, which are the two late symphonies that had clarinet parts. For one of Mozart's last big occasions, a public concert at the National Theater in Frankfurt in 1790, an eyewitness report actually survives. Mozart made a special journey to Frankfurt because at this time there were so many festivities surrounding the coronation of the new emperor, Leopold II. He knew it presented an excellent opportunity for concert income. A copy of the advertising poster with its program has survived, and the eyewitness, Count Ludwig von Bentheim-Steinfurt, also lists the pieces that were performed, so we know that it was a very similar concert to the one that I described earlier, opening with a new grand symphony by Mozart. As you could see, the top line of the program is the new grand symphony. Then there were several arias by noted sopranos, interspersed with 2 Mozart concertos featuring the composer at the piano, as well as some solo opera improvisation. Bentheim-Steinfurt notes that the concert began at 11 o'clock in the morning, and he makes this wonderful note about the program. He said, "Mozart played a concerto composed by him, which was of an extraordinary prettiness and charm. He had a forte piano by Stein of Augsburg, which must be supreme of its kind. Monsieur Mozart is a small man of rather pleasant appearance. He had a coat of brown marine satin, nicely embroidered." Of Mozart's improvisation, the Count remarked that it was very charming. He shone infinitely, exhibiting all the power of his talent. The only problem arrived at the end of the concert, about which the Count states, "The last symphony was not given, for it was almost 2 o'clock, and everybody was sighing for dinner. The music lasted 3 hours." If, as was customary, the concert began with the opening movements of a symphony, with the finale reserved for the end, then it seems a terrible pity that the audience never got to hear the conclusion of one of Mozart's last great symphonies. But this also demonstrates that even when confronted with Mozart himself, in person, and with music of the most exalted and sublime kind, an audience is, after all, only human. It will get hungry. It will sigh for its dinner. Knowing musicians, dinner is probably what Mozart was thinking about too. And at that, I think I will stop and we should all go get a snack.